All right, recording has started. Phil, why don't you take it away and introduce yourself for those that don't know who you are?
Hi, everybody. My name is Phil Swanzy. I work for the Pennsylvania State University. I've been with the university probably for about 20 years. Yeah, right. January is my 20th year anniversary. For working for the university, I've been through the university's iterations of Active Directory, and I built its greenfield. And this presentation is basically the wrap up of this 8-year. I could almost say my personal effort to try to get a true Active Directory at Penn State. I can't say that I actually made this happen, but I tell you what, if I did not fight tooth and nail to push leadership to make it happen, so hopefully I was instrumental in actually making a true Active Directory at the Penn State University occur. And we'll get into a little bit about why and how long this journey was and what occurred about it and why I'm presenting at this consolidation journey at the Microsoft High Ed, because I think it's a little bit of a circular, like I'm closing the loop on this 8-year is a loop that's being closed with the Microsoft Higher Ed group. And again, it was Windows Higher Ed previously, but we'll see about that in the presentation. So we take a look here, you can see again the beginning of Active Directory at the university, where we didn't have Active Directory, right? We didn't even run NT4 or anything like that at the Active Directory level. Most of the stuff was Kerberos. DCE was we used a DCE auth for a little bit. And we basically, when MIT v5 Kerberos Realm was built, they used a lowercase realm name, dce.psu.edu. And we basically used that in conjunction with IBM Tivoli for many years. And the server 2003 Active Directory that was built in 2003 was an Active Directory that was using shadow accounts, shadow passwords. So it had a MIT one-way trust, and basically it had no password. So NTLM auth did not work. So short name auth or NTLM auth never worked. So that, and I supported that Active Directory for many years. So there were a lot of problems that occurred because of that and a lot of challenges. And in 2012, as you can see, a change. The university was beginning talks at that time to change authentication at the university. They needed to do something different. The writing on the wall was around. So what were some of the challenges, right? And I just said NTLM auth was one of them, right? Realm capitalization became an issue. A lowercase realm. Well, Microsoft loves capitalizing everything. So every OS release we had at that time with the old Active Directory was always test with Microsoft, submit a bug report because they're capitalizing the realm. And we needed them to maintain case. Oh, it was hectic for every patch, every release, every service pack. Passwords in general, it was never a sync, it was never a dual set. It was just passwords were randomized in the Active Directory on the user account. It used a disjoint namespace. So the Active Directory realm name was different from the domain controller name. Fully qualified domain name, and those were different from the fully qualified domain names of the user service principals, and those were different from the fully qualified domain names of any device that was bound to Active Directory. So that in itself is just a web of nightmares. The research we did, right? This is where it comes into why Microsoft High Ed, why am I presenting here about our roadmap, right? Well, in 2014 at the Windows High Ed conference, we volunteered to be on a discussion panel and asked most of the Win High Ed people in attendance at that peer discussion panel, what do they think what are their opinions of the best way to build an Active Directory from greenfield, like basically bare bones. If we were building from the ground up and we could decide everything, what do we need to do? And so we gathered a huge amount of, data and information from that meeting. And I don't have a snapshot of it, but I have to dig back through my OneNote notes. But basically, there's this huge list of just notes I had from that meeting of recommendations, what they did in their Active Directories and what problems they ran into. And of course, at an institution our size, and I say Penn State our sizes, we have 200,000 active, what we call standard users, but overall we have 1.3 million user account objects in our Active Directory. So that right there in itself poses a very big challenge about that kind of account size, right? So we were talking to, and we got information from organizations very low level about delegation and security controls and stuff. And then you had organizations that were very high and very disjoint, where how do you deal with a user population of that size, right? What's the best methodology, flattened OU structures, single OU for users, naming convention requirements, kind of doing a least privileged delegated model with account separation at the time, OU monitoring, permission delegation, user account creation, naming, failures, the default OU being leveraged. And then we had to take all that information, and it was leadership buy-in, right? What is leadership currently in from 2000 to 2012 at the time, and even walking into 2014, still was very much like, well, Kerberos is the answer and LDAP. And at the time we were upgrading to Open LDAP away from Tivoli. And they assumed that Active Directory or Microsoft Active Directory was a cost to central IT, right? Well, it is. But so is MIT Kerberos and LDAP, but they forgot that cost, the actual cost, because we've been running it for 10 years, 12 years. So what we had to do then when we got back to the university with all of this information was we decided to do a dive in for cost analysis. So we went across the university, and we tried to do a discovery on all known Active Directories. And again, this is back in 2014, 2015. We found at the time about 65 Active Directories, right? Disparate Active Directories across the university. And we had to expose this 65 Active Directories cost, right? So what's the cost of running an Active Directory, right? So we had to do estimated cost of servers plus software plus hosting plus backup plus security, monitoring, VPNs, the IT admin support, third-party software. What was that cost analysis, and what was the estimated cost of that? And we had to tier it, right? It was your single, and I hear somebody with their mic on. Could somebody make sure we're muted? I think I hear somebody's on. To double check. Michael. Michael, can you mute? I mean, get a little bit of. Here, I'll mute you. Oh, no, maybe he did. Okay, good. Sorry, that was just it was humming in my ear. It was a bit slightly distracting for me. So what we ran into was this problem of, once we exposed this cost between your low tier Active Directory, which is most people had a single box in a closet that was hosting some of their, desktops in like a single unit. Then you had your middle tier, which was an actual, primary and secondary Active Directory at the time, primary, secondary, right? Active Directory still in the same building, but at least there were two, and they had some backup software running on them. And that was supporting maybe the floor or the building's Active Directory. And then you had these colleges Active Directories like the IST, like Information Science Technology, the Engineering Active Directory, which were bigger Active Directories spread out. And they were like our upper tier of cost analysis. So we did that. We broke it down for them. And then again back in 2014, and then we did what we were looking for was The problem, the biggest issue was central IT was not known for delivering services. We were at the time at Penn State known for delivering technologies, right? Kerberos is a technology. We put it out there and we said anybody can use it. We didn't tell them how to use it. We didn't provide any documentation on how to use it except the KRB5 conf file here. But we didn't say if you're running Apache, do this. If you're running, Scientific Linux, do this. If you're running Windows, you have to do this. We didn't do any of that documentation. None of that information was available. They had to go dig it up themselves. And sure, if they called us and asked us or finally figured out how to get a support ticket to us, we'd tell them how to do it, but we never wrote anything about it. So we had very bad marks against central IT for that. So that was another thing that, that philosophy had to change internally. So the discovery began, right, in early 2013, 65 directories were found. We decided at that time, because we got approval, but the project name was going to be what we called One Forest. Penn State at the time was very big on the word one, right? One team, one IT, so One Forest, right? One forest to rule them all is what some people called it. So we had that very bad name going for us right out of the gate, and we didn't even realize it until somebody at one of the early meetings said that, right? One forest to rule them all. And then it was picking a migration software. How do you migrate at the time 64 disparate or 65 disparate Active Directories and using the right kind of profile migration software to move them in, right? So we had to sit here and look at Forensic IT, Dell Migration, and Microsoft, and Dell Migration Manager. Now I think it's changed its name again, and I can't keep track of the migration software's names because Microsoft's the only one I think has stayed the same. Maybe Forensic IT is still Forensic IT. So we picked the Dell Migration Manager at the time because we were trying to avoid Active Directory trusts. We wanted to maintain the security of the Active Directory and its integrity. So we didn't want to bring over identity cruft. And at the time, Microsoft's profile migration stuff, wanted a trust, right? And we didn't want to bring over the user's identity stuff from their other Active Directory. We wanted to leave all that behind. And again, that was at the time, right? It doesn't mean that hasn't changed since then. So what we really discovered, well, when we got into the consolidation project, and actually, so we built this Active Directory, right? When we got into it and when we actually started to say we had a migration software package for these people, oh, wait, there are 95 disparate Active Directories and DNS isolated Active Directories. So Active Directories that weren't even on the Penn State network, but still on the Penn State network, but had no name resolution. So you couldn't find them, but everybody at that unit could find them. And then people had legacy requirements that with certain applications that required LM, DES encryption, ARC4 encryption, NTLM v1 was required for all of these legacy applications these units were running. And it's like, whoa, well, our Active Directory, no, it was built around a secure model. So we built it with, we out of the gate jumped to AES 128, AES 256 required. We disabled the previous encryptions. We moved right to NTLM v2 and disabled NTLM v1. We wouldn't even host it. Another problem we had was we also required, secure LDAP lookups, right? Secure binds. We didn't allow 389 open. Well, that required everybody to change how their products were because they couldn't do open binds to our Active Directory. They had to go through 636, right? The LDAP service. And we required certificate-based binding. Now, that means they had to, at least be up to date on the certificates on their systems or machines. And now the good news is we did choose Certigo, what it's called now, or Sectico, maybe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it was the in-common certificate service that's public. We chose them, which was good for a public cert, but here's the problem we ran into. We also built a PKI service with our Active Directory. That inherently caused a problem with the PKI service wanting to put the domain certificate And in Active Directory certificate services, it's the most recent issued, or is it most recent, or the one that expires? Yeah, the one that expires later, the latest. So if we requested our in common public cert and then our domain server certificate was renewed by the PKI service and it expired later than the in common cert, basically it would choose our internal PKI. Well, we didn't want that. So then we had to realize we had to put it in there was the store, you had to put it internally. And this really just caused a lot of this kind of like gripe and questions. And what we really discovered were a lot of problems that we did not even think about. So as the challenges started to be surfaced, disjoint IT across the organization really worked against us because we had no real, at the time, communication platform. The leadership communication really was what broke down, because leadership, from the cost perspective, wanted central Active Directory, but leadership also was in tune with their local IT. So local IT was telling them we couldn't meet the needs of what they were providing. So we had this very big challenge about trying to break that down and really figure out where the problems were. Staffing the actual migration was a very big problem because no unit had extra man hours to actually staff the migration. So we needed to actually have people do the migration and do the push buttons in the Dell Migration Manager for them, where they just supplied the machines and we hit the buttons and then troubleshoot any problems that surfaced, right? Then it was hardware versus virtual infrastructure. And we had this problem where when they moved us to virtual infrastructure, it is really quickly noticeable in Active Directory. And it's kind of a warning. When your resources hit over 80%, you're dropping information, especially when you're an organization our size. I mean, we still see it from time to time, but VMware infrastructure or hyper infrastructure, if it's not properly or dedicated, you're really running this risk of corrupted GPOs because they're not replicating, corrupted user accounts, duplicate user IDs, incorrect named user IDs, just a whole ball of information where like things are being dropped based on how resource starved a domain controller is, based on where its location is. And with the poor man's round robin of Active Directory, you really can't tell it to choose the DCs that are resourced appropriately. It'll find its way to the bad one sooner or later. Somebody will. Some of the other technical challenges we had were naming convention. That we solved in the sense from the Win High Ed group. Having a naming convention out of the gate really saved us a ton of time, because we found out really quickly it really eased how things were supposed to be put in Active Directory, and we stuck to it, right? We didn't bend on it. We had this other problem of major services tied to Kerberos, so Active Directory was not deemed as important. Kerberos is still running to this day because major services are still on it. We can't get them off. Root level GPOs enforced. Apparently that's just a bad thing. We tried to help people secure their environments, and boy, did that just, everybody found every little nook and cranny reason to basically say they needed to be excluded from that GPO because they had their own security settings they needed to apply. So we just lifted those out. We did multi-accounts at the time, but as we found out, is a separate account for each delegation really the right answer? We weren't sure. So when we built the Active Directory, people got what we called a server admin account, a workstation admin account, a user account. Not everybody, but just the admins, right? And an OU account. Now we told them to protect the OU account as if it was their domain account, because that governed their entire OU. But what we found out is server admins and OU admins, those guys really didn't understand the separation right there, and was those two account separations really needed? From a security standpoint, we could see it from Pash the Hash and stuff like that, because we saw a couple of events at Penn State that we saw exactly where that occurred. but from a usability standpoint, it really caused onboarding difficulties. Time-based group implementation from Active Directory, we never fully embraced because it seemed like something that was partially implemented, like was command line, and it was difficult to use. People wanted it, but there was just no easy way to leverage it. POSIX. Everybody said it was a requirement at the beginning of our Active Directory build. We built Active Directory, and we probably see maybe 5 units actually leverage the internal POSIX attributes. So was it really needed? We did the extension to add them in, and yet we don't really see a whole lot of people leveraging them. So the service technical challenges, well, the hardware we purchased, we had dedicated hardware in 2013, but we moved to virtual machines in 2017. We still, at the time in 2018, were not setting passwords in Active Directory, and we were on server core. Ugh. The nightmares with server core is a whole different issue, but basically around 2018 to 2019, we went to from server 2012 R2 to server. We upgraded to the most current version 2019 on all our DCs, and we went GUI. We ditched server core, and at that time when we did that upgrade, we also started doing a dual set password. So we had passwords being set in the Kerberos realm and against Active Directory. So again, it's dual set, not a sync. We had what we called remote desktop gateways for security for multiple least privileged accounts and separation of duties. So there were different RDS servers for different duties for the MMC console. Office 365 caused a lot of information gaps about how our Active Directory was built and how it integrated with Azure. Because at the time, I mean, our tenant, the Penn State tenant's been around since the live.edu days. But so we had some of those issues there where some of the security controls were not the same as a default tenant, and nobody knew that because nobody had touched the tenant. I would say the person who owned the tenant left in like 2011, and nobody touched the tenant till 2015, and nobody audited it. So we had that challenge when we realized that that was occurring. So, and we at the time when we integrated, we also built the Active Directory to be federated, right? So we were doing the Azure AD Connect, but we were federated through Shibboleth. So we didn't do Azure AD Connect with password at the time. It wasn't turned on until after we had the dual sync. So at the late 2019 is when we actually turned on the Azure AD Connect password sync for our university. There's a huge disconnect of information about Azure AD Connect with the Office 365 team, because the Office 365 team was talking about using Office 365, and we had this issue of, well, we're federated, but that doesn't equal hybrid join, nor does it equal Azure AD join. And then who supports Intune, device sync, Windows Hello? How do we do MFA? And then we were trying to, there was a huge onion of information we were peeling apart that just because Active Directory is using Azure AD Connect, it doesn't mean all of this is enabled. And I think the last thing we had was, let me see here, my notes. Oh yes, we had the object hard limits that we hit when we were doing Azure AD Connect syncing because of our massive user population. And again, it was probably mostly our fault, but read the Microsoft documentation because it is written in there, but there is a hard limit of 300,000 objects by default, and you have to get that increased. And that is a hard limit, again, and that will stop Office 365 from functioning correctly. People will see errors when they try to create a new team and stuff like that. So where we are now, right? Where did all of this lead? Finally, we got the password sync, right? So we finally have passwords. Active Directory was made the primary password store. So we're actually in front of the Kerberos realm. So if a password set occurs across both realms, we're first in the sense that if Kerberos fails, we don't care anymore. We have a new lifetime password policy in Active Directory, which the users really embraced, and it's documented on our information website. But basically, a password reset only needs to occur when a compromise is found or if a compromise is noticed. So a password reset occurs at that time, but we don't force users to reset their passwords, which they embraced holistically, and that came with Active Directory, not the Kerberos realm. We're still externally DNS integrated. We were using dynamic DNS with TISIG on Proteus, and that is now being upgraded, or they're migrating to efficiency IP. But we still are doing dynamic DNS with TISIG. External to Active Directory. Our Active Directory does not run DNS. We struggle with VM hosting still, as we are 8 Active Directories, all 2019 servers, and 32 gig multi-location. So we also have other account types. We are merging the admin accounts finally, all of those segmented accounts, because we're using CyberArk in our infrastructure. So instead of this separation of accounts for every user, we're doing pools of accounts for units. And how many pools of accounts, and those accounts can be separated by permissions. We are now populating the university service accounts as well, because those service accounts are starting to be leveraged in Azure for Azure services and REST APIs and REST calls. So we are now doing service account syncing. Groups for Azure Active Directory, of course, we're syncing. We just upgraded the Azure AD Connect tool to leverage the V2 APIs. So we are now syncing large groups, and we do have a group out there that's 200,000 that's being synced up. Our privileged access management integration is CyberArk, of course, and I spoke about it a couple of times. We're replacing multi-accounts, moving pools of accounts, and PAWS are still leveraged, and PAWS are privileged access workstations. That is the old name. I don't know what they're called now. PAWS was not our name. It used to be a Microsoft document name, but I think they call them something else now. But we still use them for our domain admins. Our Active Directory admins still use these privileged access workstations, which are built securely and are leveraged for them because they have domain and enterprise admin rights. And again, they still have to use CyberArk to get those domain and enterprise admin rights, but it's just another step in securing those accounts from past the hash and things of that nature. Provisioning strategy, again, 1.3 million objects. We're doing the extension attributes, leveraging those for extra identity attributes, like some of the shibboleth information that we used to release to apps. We now have that in Active Directory, and again, only public information. We do not release anything to Azure Active Directory in the extension attributes if it is deemed private by our security and compliance office. Let's see here. I'm using user locking strategy. I think that's been the biggest one. We've enabled finally on demand. We found a problem with on demand locking with if a role is associated with the account in Azure, you cannot lock the account. You have to remove them from the Azure app or the Azure administrative role first. So they got to be out of that role first, or you're going to get an error that you have no permission to do it. So we found that problem, so we couldn't issue a lock. So we're trying to get that resolved, and basically it's just removing them from a group that is assigned to that role, right? So we have to remove them from that group first, then we can issue the lock. Security internal audit. We're going through a big internal audit right now, so I'm sure they're going to find some stuff with our own little processes that we've forgotten over the years that we got to clean up. We also have to prove our own security claims. We've had to prove that our app locker on the domain controller is enabled and working. So we literally had to go in our test domain and prove that we couldn't. In this use case, we had to actually copy the Firefox executable up to the DC while we had to securely track that it was being copied securely, and then also that when we tried to lock the executable, AppLocker picked it up and blocked it. So that was an interesting use case, and we had to do it in prod right in front of the audit controls. Fun. So the extras that we're still looking at is how do we deal with guest accounts? Because Azure AD introduced this thing of guest accounts. We still don't know what to do with those. And then a proper deprovisioning strategy. Because again, with this whole limit that we're hitting, this hard limit, what we realized is as an academia is maybe we need to revisit our life cycle policy and figure out what's a true strategy that aligns with us leveraging Azure Active Directory, and what can we do to better that policy? Because before we never had to worry about that, but now we do. So again, there's my contact information. And if you have any questions generally about Active Directory and how we built it, or you want a meeting with the Active Directory team on what they're doing in their processes, that's an Active Directory request form in our ServiceNow form. It is public facing, so you can certainly submit a request to meet with the team. We get requests from other institutions all the time, or you can contact me directly. I am certainly not opposed to that. At this time, I'd open it up for questions. Ooh, none, right?
There's been a bunch of chatting going on in the chat. I don't know if you can see the chat window or not.
Oh, sorry, I had to switch my screens here. There we go. I'm sure most of the guys probably answered these because Brian has been around since I started building this, right? And I'm sure a couple of these others have been. Let's see if I can. So I'm forced to rule them all. Yeah, let's see. We had 50 domains. There's still, yep. Oh, so by the way, while I'm reading through these questions, right, we did the consolidation project, like anything in academia, is still not done. There's about 5 left. So I will say this, I'm not going to give another presentation in when those 5 are gone. It's just going to be, you know. You don't have to listen to me drone on again about Active Directory and consolidation. We did avoid trusts heavily. So that was the good news about our Active Directory. I think at the time, through the consolidation project, we only had to trust 2 Active Directories, which through begrudgingly we did, which it was our engineering, or not our engineering, but information sciences technology, the IST group, and the trust to athletics, our athletics department, you know, football, because football must run. So I haven't seen, and if anybody wants, you can open your mic up and ask if I'm missing your question.
There is a hand up.
Oh, Mark.
Mark.
Yeah, you mentioned your cert issues on your DCs. How did you end up handling that? I noticed somebody in the chat said they added another enhanced key usage. How did you guys handle that with your in-common versus your internal?
So there is a key store, and I'd have to look what the key store is, but there actually is and you can Google it, but it is the directory key store. And it's how do you insert a certificate into the Active Directory key store. Without Googling it in front of you guys, and I'd have to look back at our documentation too, but basically there is another hidden key store on the DC. It's not the default. And you can actually inject a certificate there, and that answers all Active Directory LDAP queries. So that certificate is then used for all the LDAP queries. So we injected the in-common cert there, and on the domain itself, both certs exist in the domain store, the standard store, but we don't have to worry about that problem arising then.
And as Billy brought up, this is a Microsoft and higher ed not a Google and higher ed. So we
Yeah.
bing things here. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if you bing it, but it is something we found out. And I know if you look it up now, it's like, if you bing it, it is something like the Active Directory LDAP certificate store. And there are a couple things where you can find out about how to do it that way. And if you want, Mark, if you need it, that direct information, I can get you that link right after this meeting. I can shoot it to you whether in Teams or an email, basically, but I can get you our documentation about what we did.
Thanks. I think I do have that info. I was wondering if you had gone down the road of within Common trying to get those required kind of extended uses in there. We've run into something similar with Windows Hello for Business. So did you guys roll out Windows Hello for Business at your? No. Okay. Thanks.
No, and that's why, right? We haven't hit that challenge yet. So we haven't faced that yet. I know that's coming down the road. Many units have asked for Windows Hello, and yet we're not there yet to deploy that. But certainly right now, the solution was that certificate store. You're absolutely right. We'll probably be hitting this down the road when we try to deploy Windows Hello for Business.
And I think one of the hurdles that you guys have is you don't have hybrid Azure AD joins, so you can't really do.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's the first step, right? We got to get hybrid done. Then we can actually start looking at seamless Web SSO and Windows Hello for Business.
There's a question from Raphael. In addition to extension attributes, do you create new attributes to hold info unique to PSU?
No, we have avoided customization of the schema. We have really been trying to stick to the bare bones because we wanted to maintain a holistic view of our Active Directory. So when we made Microsoft support calls, we weren't asked, well, what's this? What's that? Why is this here?
And Robert asked, do you consider using a load balancer with the income insert for LDAP front end?
We do. We can't seem to get people to stop choosing between the realm name versus the load balance name. So some systems or some applications out there want to use the AD, or our Active Directory is called ad.psu.edu, right? Certain services just want to point right to that, right? That's what they discover. We do have a true load balanced with the income insert on it, which is ldap.ad.psu.edu, right? But that's what we always tell people to use, but we seem to not be able to stop services from. There are still those random people out there that just point to ad.psu.edu.
Brian asked, will you continue to offer domain migration services? We ended our migration offering a couple of years ago.
Yep, we terminated ours this summer. Not this, this summer. So we stopped renewing the software. We shut the servers down. Units are on their own to finish and wrap up their migration, and they have to work through. So one of the things to get units off of their Active Directories is central IT or the budget office is actually charging these units the full cost of running Active Directory now. They're not letting them slide with their running Active Directory, and they can keep getting it approved. They actually have to pay to run Active Directory at the institution, right? It's funny money.
Nice. Elvis says, interested in the challenges faced with server core versus GUI.
Oh, yes. Yeah, the challenges faced with that were basically, so first it was internal staff training, right? To learn how to use core correctly and to know which security context you were always in from where. Once you figured that out and you knew your security contexts each time you opened a new window, it was pretty easy to navigate. But our biggest problems were every time we made a Microsoft support call, we would spend probably about 3 days before we got somebody that could get us core support. And so you'd lose 3 days of like a production, degradation or outage. The one time we had a memory leak on 2012 R2 and we didn't realize it. What was causing it, but apparently it was a known memory leak because they linked us to some random page. But it took 3 days, 3 full days of us staying up overnight, rebooting the DCs to try to keep the domain controllers up as this memory leak ran rampant. And every time each new engineer got on the call, they wanted us to run perfmon on the DC. They're like, well, just go to your start menu, open perfmon. And we're like, we don't have a start menu.
Robert writes, did you have any challenges from the application owners to agree on timely migrations?
Yeah, every one of them.
Yes.
In academia, we know there's no such good time for any unit, right? They're always at their max and busiest. So it was a real struggle, which is why the consolidation project took 5 to 6 years and is still kind of ongoing, right? It was just, when's a good time? Yeah, I'll have to look into that, Keith. That's interesting that it helps a lot with dealing with core now, because it's really, we had to ditch it.
That seems to be the end of our questions. If anybody has any questions, please do come off mute and ask away. If not, we'll give everybody 18 minutes or so back before the next session. All right, at this point,
Yeah, I figured this, I was going to say, I figured this session wouldn't be that long because this was
Mhm.
more like a review for most people that did attend, but it is neat to hear, right? The full path.
Any last minute stuff before I stop the recording? All right, stopping the recording.